Hello and welcome to Memon and Higham flipped. So just the spelling of that is M-E-M-O-N and Higham, so H-I-G-H-A-M, so Memon and Higham. And it's 1999 that this kind of research has been carried out, or that this article has been written, because that brings me to your first heading, which needs to be research method. So underneath that heading of research method, our research method for this bit of research for crime is a bit of a funny one. So it's actually an article which critiques, so reviews, the cognitive interview technique, which can be abbreviated to CI. So cognitive interview, CI. So if you see that anywhere, then CI is just meaning cognitive interview. So Memon and Higham have basically written an article talking about the good and bad things to do with this cognitive interview as a way to get information from witnesses. Their discussion in this article is based around 4 themes. So these are going to be your 4 headings, and we're going to go through them one by one. So if I just give you the 4 headings that we're going to be going through. One is looking at the effectiveness of different components of the cognitive interview. One is looking at the relationship between the cognitive interview and other interviewing techniques. So we're going to be looking at interviews that we compare the cognitive interview with, so comparison interviews. Number 3 is looking at memory performance, so measures of memory. And number 4 is the effect of training quality on interview performance. So we're going to look at 4 different themes that they've kind of talked about in this. Firstly, before we get into looking at kind of section 1 of this article, you need to know something about the cognitive interview. So give yourself a little subheading of cognitive interview. So just in case you aren't sure on the spelling of that, so C-O-G-N-I-T-I-V-E, cognitive, and then interview. There are 4 parts to a cognitive interview, so 4 in total. Number 1. Mental context reinstatement. The first part of a cognitive interview is where the witness is asked to mentally reconstruct the external and internal events which existed as part of the crime. So they have to kind of imagine the crime scene, mentally reconstruct what went on when that crime happened. So kind of using their imagination a little bit, but hopefully it'll be factual. So imagining in their minds what went on, and just going along with that bit of the cognitive interview, Milne showed that, so Milne, M-I-L-N-E, showed that context reinstatement used alone obtained as much information from witnesses as using the whole cognitive interview strategy. So context reinstatement, this first step of the cognitive interview, is really effective, getting them to remember what happened in the crime scene. Part number 2 of the cognitive interview is that witnesses are asked to report everything. So this is where the witness is given the instruction to recall, without screening, all of the details from the to-be-remembered event, even if they think they might be irrelevant. So they're told, report absolutely everything you can possibly remember, down to things like the smell, colour of things, absolutely everything. Part 3 of the cognitive interview is that witnesses are asked to recall from a variety of different perspectives. So the technique tries to encourage witnesses to place themselves in the shoes of the victim, assuming that the witness isn't the victim, or of another witness to report what they would have seen. So the third part of cognitive interview, put yourself in someone else's shoes and tell me what they would have seen when they witnessed this crime. Part number 3 of the cognitive interview is that witnesses are asked, in order to do this effectively, I'm just checking that I've given you the first 2 bits accurately. Yes, I have. So the last part is that they're asked to make retrieval attempts from different starting points. So after they've done context reinstatement, they've reported everything and they've reported from different perspectives, they are asked, start from the middle of the story, start from the end of the story. So the 4th step of a cognitive interview is getting the witness to start from different points in the story. So rather than going from beginning to end, now go from the middle, go from the end, so getting them to kind of report their story in a different order. So the 4 steps of the cognitive interview that you should have written down are context reinstatement, report everything, recall from different perspectives, and report from a different order, so changing the order that they're reporting in, so making retrieval attempts from different starting points. So that is what a cognitive interview is. What you now need to know is the effectiveness of different components of the cognitive interview. So if you give yourself a heading of effectiveness of different components of the cognitive interview technique. In terms of effectiveness then, Memon and Higham suggested that in order to fully test the effectiveness of the cognitive interview, so the CI, that they needed to study each different part of the cognitive interview, so the 4 different steps, separately, in order to work out how effective each step is, which makes sense. So Memon tested context reinstatement, which is step 1 of the cognitive interview, so remembering and imagining the crime scene. They tested that step against the step that requires them to recall from a variety of different perspectives, and against the step that requires them to recall things from a different order. So they tested 3 different steps in the cognitive interview against each other. They did this by using a group of children, so 5 to 8 year olds, and they found that there was no difference in cognitive interview techniques and no difference between the steps. So they found that each step of the cognitive interview was as effective as the other one. So all 4 steps of the cognitive interview, Memon and Higham found from their sample of 5 to 8 year olds, they are all effective. So all the steps work well. Research by Milne, so Milne, compared the full cognitive interview against each step. So they had a group where they gave them the entire cognitive interview, and then they had another group where they only did 1 step of the cognitive interview with them, and they found that actually context reinstatement was the most effective step. So first experiment, they said all the steps were as effective as each other, but in experiment 2, they found that actually context reinstatement, that first step, getting them to recall events from the crime scene, that is the most effective step when it comes to the cognitive interview. So that's kind of the best thing, get them to recall the events that they think they've seen in the crime scene. That seems to be the best way to kind of get information from our witnesses. So in section 2, so underneath that heading, you should have written that first study, we've got the effectiveness, all 4 steps are as effective as one another. And in the second study, we find that context reinstatement is actually the most effective component when doing the cognitive interview. In terms of doing the cognitive interview, they've also found when they're testing the effectiveness of it that children seem to find it the most difficult. So in terms of who has the most difficulty when using these cognitive techniques, so recalling the crime scene and recalling things in a different perspective, they found children struggle with this the most. So using cognitive interview with children isn't that effective because they aren't very good at using it and doing it. So that's the effectiveness of different parts of the cognitive interview. New heading now, so comparison interviews. So when it came to the comparison interviews, they were looking at comparing the cognitive interview technique with other types of interviews to see which one was better. So they compared the cognitive interview with the guided memory interview. So the guided memory interview, they also compared it with the standard interview. So the standard technique that they normally use when they carry out interview procedures. They also tested it against hypnosis. So they tested the cognitive interview technique against something called the guided memory interview, against the structured interview, and against hypnosis. In terms of their comparisons then, they found that the standard interview, which is the name given to the type of interview that police officers were using before the cognitive interview, so just kind of the standard asking questions from the witness and getting them to answer them, they found that that technique, that the cognitive interview was actually better in terms of comparing it, so it produced better results than the standard interview did. And they found that the large differences between the two is that in the cognitive interview, the witness was likely to be more focused on what they were doing, and the motivation of the witnesses is higher because they receive more attention from the police officer when they do a cognitive interview technique, because they're asking them much more questions than they do when they kind of do the standard structured interview. What they eventually found, though, in these comparison interviews, was that comparing the cognitive interview with the standard interview didn't really work because the standard interview was too simplistic. So though they initially found, yep, cognitive interview is better than the standard interview, they went on to say we need a more complex interview to compare our cognitive interview technique with. And that's when they came up with this comparing it with the guided memory technique. So the guided memory interview draws upon principles of context reinstatement, so it's getting you to recreate the crime scene in your mind, and it encourages witnesses to mentally reinstate the context that the crime scene happened in. So a bit like in the cognitive interview in step 1, where they're being asked to recreate the crime scene in their mind, with the guided memory interview, it's a similar thing. That meant that Memon and Higham said comparing the cognitive interview with the guided memory interview is much better because they're similar, so therefore it makes sense to compare them and we can see which one is better. So it means that they aimed to establish whether the effects of the cognitive interview on technique on memory are due to kind of context reinstatement alone, or is it all the other bits that also make it good? What they found was that the cognitive interview strategy, again, seemed to be better when it came to comparing it with the guided memory technique. So from the comparison interviews, we found cognitive interview is better than the structured interview. It's better than our guided memory technique. And Memon and Higham say we're better off comparing the cognitive interview with guided memory than standard interview, because guided memory and context and cognitive interview are the most similar. Moving on then, so a new heading of measures of memory. So measures of memory, so that's your third heading for this article. Memon and Higham suggested that research into the cognitive interview technique had been too simplistic. So they said that trying to work out whether this is an effective interview technique, the way those studies have been done, they're not complex enough, they don't show us enough information, and they don't show us or tell us how cognitive interview might influence something called memory monitoring. Memory monitoring is when a person is asked a question and they search in their long-term memory for possible answers. From those, the candidate selects a response that most fits the question that they've been asked. So for example, in a standard police interview, their response criteria might be quite strict, because you're told in a standard interview and you say, I must tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So that means that when the witness is looking in their mind, in their long-term memories for an answer, they might not give an answer if they don't think it is the whole truth, because that's what memory monitoring is. They're kind of looking through their memory for an answer the police officer wants, and if they don't think it's the answer the police officer wants, they won't give it. So in that case, they're not going to give it if they don't think it's the whole truth, because they've been told to give the whole truth. So that means they might withhold a response. In the cognitive interview technique, the instruction to report everything means that the witness is less likely to do that. They're less likely to not say something because they're told, say everything that you possibly can. So it suggests that actually the cognitive interview technique is good when it comes to memory, because it's requiring you to report absolutely everything you can remember and encouraging you not to leave anything behind. So not to withhold a response or not say something, because it's telling you to give all of the information that you possibly have. The fourth heading then, quality of training. So what did Memon and Higham say about training when it comes to the cognitive interview? Early studies into the cognitive interview technique often didn't say the type and quality of training that was given to interviewers that were delivering the cognitive interview. So sometimes training meant simply reading about the techniques from a brief handout. So in some cases, when people said that they trained to deliver the cognitive interview, actually all they'd done was read a bit of paper that told them how to do those 4 steps. Sometimes the interviewers simply read out the instructions for the cognitive technique, so they sat there and went, mentally reinstate the crime scene in your mind now. Report everything that you hear. So they're just reading off of a sheet to the witness, instructing them what to do, rather than being properly trained in what they're doing. So Memon and Higham were saying that actually interview training is really important, and that it encourages officers to use the cognitive interview techniques properly. So experienced officers received a total of 4 hours training in their cognitive interview techniques, and that's what should be happening. So cognitive interview does require a lot of training. So they are saying that future research and future cognitive interview training should be so that actually police officers should be identified by by their potential for the training. So rather than just putting any old person into the training, we should be picking people we think would be really good at delivering the cognitive interview, putting them through the cognitive interview training, and getting them to sit with a witness and do it. Memon and Higham do point out, though, the problem with this strategy is that it assumes that poor interviewers won't benefit from training, and that you should just train people who we think are already going to be good at it, which isn't maybe a good way to go. Going on then, so Memon and Higham identified that other problems that need to be addressed when we're researching cognitive interview and kind of looking into it is that we need to take into account the training of the officers in the research where they're doing these cognitive interviews, their attitude and their prior interview experience and performance when it comes to giving out cognitive interviews. So when we're looking at research into cognitive interview, we need to know and be aware of the officers that are delivering those interviews, what their experience is like, what their performance is like, and what their attitudes are like. So you should have information on the 4 steps of the cognitive interview, some information on the effectiveness of different bits of the cognitive interview, some information on comparison interviews, some information on measures of memory, and some information on quality of training. I have also given you a textbook handout to go along with this flipped, just because it's quite a complicated one, so I feel like the handout will help you along with this video to understand this article. So refer to that as well when you're doing the quiz and when you're making notes, and we'll be going over this more in class and making more notes and answering any questions.